take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy?
I'm a human being, god damn it! My life has value! It's time to ask yourself what you believe.
Mass murder, torture, perjury, embezzlement, fraud, deception, treason. These are just a few of your many crimes against humanity. You will not win this war, for you are fighting the very essence of humanity.
Hi, welcome to Truth or Talk. I'm April Bowden.
And I'm Virstyne Henry.
Please visit our website at truthertalk.com. We have our archive shows, our essays, our Conspiracy Realist t-shirt, official stories by Liam Sheff. You can offer a donation if you have anything lying around. We take PayPal, we take cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and all that kind of cool stuff, which helps us run the operation. We don't have any corporate sponsors whatsoever. So that would be really cool. If you have anything, that would be great. So today we're talking to Yolande Lucire. She's a scientist. She's a forensic psychologist, and she is somebody out of Australia, and she's been working on this research, which we'll let her describe it more, so I get into more detail about it. But we found it interesting because it really is going to, if it gets out into the public and everybody starts to learn about it, it would really kind of bring down a large portion of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
Because it just sort of brings awareness to, people wonder why certain people have reactions to pharmaceuticals and they get really, really sick, or they get crazy. In the cases of antidepressants, where a lot of people are on them, we know that. We know it's a widespread thing where tons and tons and tons of people are on antidepressant drugs, but not most of them don't go nuts and then go on a shooting spree and kill people. Most of them don't do that, but there are some that do, and and almost everybody who we've seen do that is on some sort of antidepressant drug. And you're like, wow, that's really weird. They're supposed to be on these antidepressants, yet they're very depressed.
They're psychotic, yeah.
And they're psychotic. And so what she's discovered is that some people, their bodies are just physically unable to metabolize and digest certain types of synthetics in the environment. And sometimes it's antidepressants, natural or otherwise, mostly unnatural, mostly synthetic pharmaceutical drugs. Their bodies can't tolerate them, so they'll get very sick and very crazy.
Supposed to be on these antidepressants are basically supposed to be making them happy, but they're making them psychotic. They
make them psychotic and give them psychosis and make, in some cases, suicidal, and were you going to say something?
No, that's it, yeah. It's making them psychotic. It's,
right.
The irony. It's supposed to make them better, but it makes them worse.
Right. It's the exact opposite of what the drug is supposed to do, because it's supposed to be an antidepressant. But if you're suicidal and psychotic, then you would be very, very depressed. So it's very strange. And and we've seen that it causes ill health in a lot of people, but not to the point that they go on a shooting spree and a rampage. So what we're trying to kind of examine here is why physiologically some people are getting really messed up, and more so than others, or at least have more of a reaction, and then they go crazy. And we did an interview, and it should be played in this. We did this interview a while ago, and we replayed it for this antidepressant series that we're working on, this Big Pharma and antidepressant drug series that we're doing with Gwen Olson, Confessions of an RX Drug Pusher. She is the book that she wrote. And when we interviewed her, she talked about her own experience being on antidepressant drugs. And it's really weird, the things that go on in people's mind, the kind of irrational thinking when they're on these things. And she described her situation where she was going to kill herself, I think, and the only reason she didn't was because she thought, like, her husband was going to be mad at her for leaving on the stove or something.
Something.
It was something really bizarre like that, where it was like, wow, that's what you were worried about?
She didn't let the dog out or something like that. Yeah, it was very, like, it was right. To the point where you're like, that's weird because it wouldn't matter if you're dead, so why are you worried that he's going to be mad at you? And some chore that she had to do. It was something like that, though.
Right. I know. It was something really bizarre like that, you know, but, yeah, like, you're dead, so why would you even think of that? And then, I don't know, but she was brings up that story because she's trying to explain how irrational these drugs make you feel and how you become very addicted to them as well. Like, she was very addicted. And so even though she felt horrible on the drug, she couldn't stop taking it. And then, she acted, she was very irrational and crazy. And then she talked about the story about her niece who had, committed suicide. And she had been on antidepressant drugs, and it was very horrible. So, I mean, at the time when we interviewed her, we didn't know anything about this work that Dr. Lucire is doing. So, you know, I didn't know to bring that up. I didn't know to think about that, but it would seem that, you know, her and her niece would be that would be described as being on this spectrum of people that go, that really just can't tolerate it at all. But I mean, truthfully, I don't know anyone who's been on that stuff for any length of time that it has seen really a benefit from it. I mean, do you know people that are on those kinds of drugs?
Not for a long time, no. I don't know anybody that's really been on any kind of pharmaceutical drug for a long time, and they're like, okay. I mean,
yeah.
I know we're talking about like Prozac or something. Mm-hmm. I've heard people say, oh, I was on it and it made me feel better, but I think that was for a short period of time, or the people I know got off their Prozac and they found other ways and they didn't need it. But not for long term. I think for short term, yeah, because it masks symptoms. Yeah. And then we get to the root of your depression. You know? Yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah, long time, no. I was trying to think. I was like, no.
Yeah, and Prozac, I think is, how much? I can't remember. It was something like 70% fluoride.
Oh, what? I didn't.
Yeah, Prozac is made with fluoride, sodium fluoride, and so fluoride is supposed to make you feel exactly. And so so fluoride in we haven't done a show. I don't think we've done a show specifically on fluoride. We've talked about it with a few of our guests. Like I want to say like Ty Bollinger. I brought it up because he's an expert on cancer, and fluoride is known to be one of the leading causes. The exposure to too much fluoride is one of the leading causes of cancer. And so I asked him about it, but we haven't like gotten into it specifically. But fluoride is bad for you, and most water systems in this country have fluoridation, where they were tricked into putting fluoride into the water so that people would become docile. And that was how they didn't they experiment on the Nazis that way too? Like, wasn't that one of the? I'm sorry, the Jews. The Nazis experimented on the Jews. Go ahead.
Yes, you're right. No, yeah, because they found that it made them docile. You know. Mm-hmm.
And right. It's one of the leading ingredients to Prozac. And these antidepressant drugs, what's weird about these too is that a lot of people are taking them, and most water municipal systems, since we brought up water, actually don't filter them out. So pharmaceuticals, anytime you're drinking from your city municipal water system, you're going to be taking in small doses of these pharmaceuticals, because people are peeing, you know, when they pee them out, they filter out, you know, the bacterias and the gross stuff, but they don't filter out the pharmaceuticals. You have to get a separate filter for something like that. And unfortunately.
You know what's so funny? Before I was even awake or knew that all this stuff was going on, I saw a small, I swear it was like a 5-minute news report on a reporter talking about that they found birth control pills and stuff in the water. And I was like, how does that even happen?
Right.
That's, you know, and now I understand why. And other pharmaceutical drugs. I remember birth control pills was one of them. It was that, and then just other pharmaceutical drugs in the water. And I was like, this is on mainstream news, and this is years ago, like maybe like 10 years ago.
Right.
And but you know, like how sometimes they might get a story might leak out, but they'll keep it real quiet. It's on for 5 minutes, and they don't like constantly repeat it. You know, so it kind of goes by the wayside.
Exactly.
But I did see it on like the news, on mainstream news.
Yeah, and these birth control in the water is actually been it messes up your endocrine systems. And there was an article that I read. I want to say it might be a couple years old now, but it was about that very thing, how birth control ended up in the water, and it was turning the gender. Like it was messing with the genders of the wildlife in the area, and the frogs.
Oh, that was
male frogs were becoming female.
Yeah, that was that guy, that scientist, and they went after him, and that was in the New Yorker, and I read that a few months ago, but I don't know when it was published. It was for Syngenta.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
They tried to discredit him, and because he was trying to come out and tell people about it too, they tried to discredit his character. And that didn't work. They started threatening his life. But I think he's still alive, and I think that's one of the reasons he was trying to get, like, you know, publicity, because they were after him physically after that. I'm sorry, go on, you were saying.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just, birth control, I think, well, we've had Leslie Carroll both on our show, and we've talked to her about the effects that birth control has on the body. It's really negative. Birth control messes up your hormone systems, messes up your endocrine systems, and it's very harsh on you. So that's really gross that people, or it's kind of, I mean, you're not taking it. It's one thing if you take it yourself and you're doing it to yourself as an adult person making that decision, but then if it just gets into your water system and you're getting it incidentally, it seems like, you know, municipal systems should be filtering that shit out. I mean, how did they get away with just letting people drink it, you know? And then, I don't know, and then some people go into this whole conspiracy. It's like, well, they're trying to neutralize gender, and they don't want males to be, they want males to be more docile, and so they're trying to give them hormone disruptors. I've heard that theory, and it kind of makes sense when you think about it in that regard, because if it's turning genders of frogs and animals, amphibians in the environment that were living in that water, then you can see how it would work on men too, and a human man in a more subtle way. Maybe it wouldn't actually change his penis into a vagina, but it would, you know, but it would.
And it would have to be during the development stage too.
Mm-hmm. Right,
and that can happen. I don't know, you know.
But it could reduce it could change his hormones, because that's what they're intended to do. Birth control is actually, it's higher levels of progesterone, so it's trying to, it takes your estrogen out of balance so that you're not producing as much estrogen, and therefore you won't be able to have, to get pregnant, because you're not producing the hormones that your body needs in order to have a baby.
Yeah.
So that's kind of gross in and of itself. Once you realize that that's what it is, it's like, that's kind of gross. You mean it's actually disrupting my hormone system? It's actually changing it, you know? And I'm going to ask Dr. Lucire about that one too, because I took birth control when I was in my 20s a couple of times, and I literally couldn't hack it. I was on it for like a few days. I think the second time the first time they put me on, I think I was on it for like a week or so, and then I got violently ill. I'm not just kidding. I'm not like, I got violently ill. And so I had to get off of it immediately, and I refused to go back in there. They were like, come in and we'll give you a new brand. I refused. I said, hell no. And then the second time was after I had my first son. They really encourage you not to get pregnant right away. So they want you to be on birth control for at least a year, because they want your body to have time to heal from after delivering a baby. So the doctors is the they that I'm talking about. And so they sent me away with a birth control prescription. I took it for like 3 days, And then I threw that shit in the trash. I said, hell no, I'm not doing this. Because it just messes with, I could feel it, you know?
Yeah.
I could feel the hormones surging through my body. It was like the worst feeling ever. And I'm lucky to be so sensitive in that regard that I just couldn't hack it, and I just threw it away. But I'm curious because most of the work that she's done, Dr. Lucire, has been surrounding antidepressant drugs. So I want to kind of know if you know, some of these other things that people seem to be, people like myself are very sensitive to and can't tolerate, could be someone that's on that spectrum of not having the enzymes to digest and to metabolize these types of things. I mean, I'm kind of grateful in a way just because I feel like I'm better off that I wasn't able to take it, you know, before I was awake to all this stuff. I didn't really even understand what it was. I didn't know that it messed up your hormones, and that's how it prevents you from having a baby. I didn't even like get that necessarily, and I can't say I really questioned how it worked, you know. But now that I know, I'm like, oh, this is horrible. Like, how is it that'll even allowed? You know, of course it's going to screw up your system. Of course it's going to give you breast cancer and make you sick. Yeah. It's like, you know, the worst thing ever. But
the thing with Mother Nature, we already have a perfect machine, you know.
Yeah. Exactly. So these things end up in the water systems. These pharmaceutical drugs, most of them do, because people pee them out and then they just don't filter them out. And so I'd suggest to anybody get yourself your own filter if you can, because the municipal systems work pretty well as far as getting out the bacteria and things like that. Like, I don't believe in the bottled water because most of that's just municipal water anyway. But as far as the getting out the birth control and getting out the SSRI, these serotonin, they sort of they suppress something in the body, which then increases your ability to produce serotonin, which is sort of like the happy hormone. So again, it's like it's screwing with your hormones. You know, that's what the antidepressant drugs are, and it's just all weird. They're just like messing around with everything, and then not recognizing that things like depression or mental disorders or neurological disorders might have to do with other areas of your health. They just mask it with these drugs, which actually are just disrupting your hormone systems, disrupting your balance of your natural balance of your body. So they're just horrible. They're just awful, and in more ways than we even imagined. Because as we're discovering with Dr. Lucire, there are people that just cannot tolerate it. Period, and they're going to go crazy. And if they were to just test people and find out who was going to react, then, you know, they might lose half their business.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why they want to keep people like her suppressed.
I wonder if could this research also be applied to food?
I think it can.
Yeah.
I think it absolutely can. You know, the person who brought this to my attention, he and I were talking about it, and he was saying that he's very sensitive to food, and he had even pesticide food, like foods that are non-organic, he has a reaction to. So he had a very serious reaction to these types of drugs where he went like nuts. And then, but then even foods that are, he says, he and his friend call them stupid foods. He loses his brain, like it doesn't function as well as his thought process isn't as good, and all of that. So I thought that was, so I think that it probably could be. It's a spectrum.
Yeah,
because she's got, it's the cytochrome P450 class, and then under that I want to say there's, well, hopefully she'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like around 200 of different enzyme deficiencies. It's like a mutation in the body. Certain enzymes just don't develop, or they don't exist in your body. You just can't metabolize certain things. And most people are deficient in some, but not necessarily all. And so you might be able to metabolize one thing, but not another. You know, maybe it's, I don't know. But I think chronic exposure to all of these things is going to be bad no matter what, no matter where you lie on this spectrum. So chronic exposure to pesticides, chronic exposure to these drugs that disrupt your hormone systems and whatnot are going to be harmful to you in the long run, you know. Because you can probably, because when we say you can't metabolize them, it means that your body's just not, it's not expelling the bad stuff. It's just not removing it. So it's just circulating in your system. Eventually it'll come out, but it takes a long time. And while it's not getting out, it's just kind of like moving about, you know. It's just sort of messing with everything, you know. It's like a foreign invader just walking around your system, just poking at everything. And so you might get a stomach ache, you might get a headache, and then you might start getting very agitated and lose it. And she's, what's it called? We're going to have to ask her to explain it. But I think it was, it's akathisia is the diagnosis that most of these people have, and it's a reaction to these drugs. And it's sort of like restless leg syndrome. It's your entire body is unable to sit. It has constant movement, restlessness. You just don't feel well from head to toe. And that's kind of how I could feel that. I would say on a certain level, that was what I would describe the second time I took the birth control, and I was on it for 3 days. That's what I felt like. I don't think I wasn't like extreme to where I was rocking back and forth. So people they get up, they walk, they sit down, they just can't for a few seconds. I didn't feel it that extreme, but I certainly could feel like I was trying to shake something out. Did you ever do that? On anything, or had they? Because you've been on different things before, right?
Yeah, I know, like,
your asthma?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. The asthma medicine. If you get really sick and you have an asthma attack and they take you to the hospital, they give you, like, I mean, there's lots of things that they do, but they can, like, they can put a tube down your lungs, they can, or, you know, down your throat into your lungs, oxygen tube, they can, or they can give you, like, a nebulizer, which is like a concentrated form of, albuterol, or whatever drug that can open up your pathways. I swear to God, I felt like my bones were going to break. I just felt brittle. My body felt brittle and just like, it was just the weirdest, like, freakiest, grossest feeling.
Yeah.
And I hate it. I hated being, taking that. And I actually had one, you know, I'm not perfect yet, but I had one of those machines that you can bring home and plug in and use, basically, with the concentrated forms of that. And I would try my best not to take them, and once, you know, every time I did, I felt crazy. I know my brother, he grew out of his asthma, or he doesn't have it as bad as me, but he would get nosebleeds all the time. And I think it was, I mean, I remember reading one of the inserts in the asthma boxes, and one of the side effects they said was like nose bleeding. And as soon as he stopped taking his asthma medication, I realized, I made this connection. I don't know how he feels, if he made the same connection, but, you know, once he stopped, I noticed once he stopped taking his inhalers, he had less nosebleeds, or maybe even not at all. And I think that was one of the, I can swear, like, that's one of the things that, you know, probably made him get nosebleeds.
Right.
So we all have different, you know, we're all just built differently. You know,
yeah.
So.
And none of us are going to have the same reaction, and just because some people might think that it's benefiting them, but then it could end up causing problems later down the road. But that's where it would be helpful for people to kind of know before taking any of these things. It would be helpful to have tests like these available, like the one we're going to ask Dr. Lucire about, how people can find out whether or not they have enzyme deficiencies. But, you know, it's not available, and of course they're going to suppress it because it's going to just completely destroy what they're doing, and the fact that they are completely aware of that certain people are going to go nuts and go psychotic and suicidal and everything like that. They know that's true. Pharmaceutical companies know that these drugs do that. And they've been, you know, and they get sued and they have to pay.
But they set aside money to make so much money off of it anyway, you know.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we learned when we had Gwen Olson on was that they calculate that in. They know, like, okay, well, we know that this is unsafe and blah, 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 so let's just calculate in how much the lawsuits are. And then that'll help us price the item. And so it'll be, and then we'll lobby to the insurance companies to try and get them to either cover it or not to cover it, based on how much money we're going to make. And so a lot of times an expensive drug doesn't mean that it's better, it means that it's worse. Because that means that they have figured out that they need the money up front in order to get, because they're going to have to pay later for their insurance companies. It's like, it's such a scam. Such a little shim-shammy on the whim-whammy, It's awful. Yeah, so it's awful the way that the system works, and but I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to tell anybody, what to do or what to put in their body or anything like that. But just, I think it's really interesting what she has to say, and you guys can Google it, CYP450, and because even in the health community, I haven't heard a lot about this. As I said, someone had brought this to my attention, former guest that we had on our show, and he thought that I might find this interesting, having an autistic son. Maybe this was something I would want to have him tested for in the future if ever they were to try and put him on any types of drugs, things like that, against my will, because of course I wouldn't want them to, but wouldn't want anybody to. So he thought, well, you might want to look into this. And even vaccines, too. I think there's that, like we were saying, how, could this also be applied to food? It might also be applied to vaccines as well. We're not certain at this point.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Because I was thinking, I mean, so many things this could be applied to. And it's also kind of, it would serve as a way of, like, helping us individually map out our own systems, and seeing what works for us, what doesn't, and we can adjust our diets to that and what we eat. It's so valuable. It can be,
Right, and it's so valuable, yet it's so suppressed. That's why.
Hey, that's the name of the game.
Yeah,
we found that. You know that now.
Yeah, we found that, and we know that now, and we're going to talk to Dr. Lucire, who is a whistleblower. She figured, she found out this stuff, she figured it out, and she told, people about it. And then they tried to suppress her and say all these nasty things about her. As we've seen time and time again, and it's so sad, every time you have these doctors who are out there being honest and telling the truth, they just, in some way or another, try to bring them down and demonize them, but I don't think they've been entirely successful. I think she's still kind of able to speak on it, but we'll ask her to describe that more. So I'm going to go ahead and cut to a short break, and if you guys will stay with us, we will be talking to Dr. Yolande Lucire on the other end of it. So please stay tuned.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thanks for having me on your radio. Even though we're not from a famous rock and roll band, if we were, even though we sound a little like we are, we'd definitely wear a Conspiracy Realist t-shirt, because they're gear, aren't they? Oh yeah, they're really gear. I want to write a song about them. Conspiracy Realist t-shirts at truthertees.com. I gotta think of the middle eight. Shop.truthertees.com. What does that mean? It's the internet. What's that? I don't know. It's a net. It's between things. Shop.truthertees.com. What's that? It's where you get Conspiracy Realist t-shirts. Oh, gear.
Hi, welcome back to Truth or Talk. On today's show, we have forensic psychiatrist Dr. Yolande Lucire, and she's coming at us today from Sydney, Australia. She's made a discovery that we found interesting regarding the use of psychiatric drugs, and we wanted to, drugs in general, I guess. We wanted to bring her on the show to talk about it today, so please welcome to the show Dr. Lucire. Hi.
Hi. Hi, and thank you. It wasn't me that made this discovery. The discovery has been around for an awfully long time. What I'm trying to do is bring the discovery from the bench, from the scientist's bench, to the bedside.
So who has discovered it? How did it first come to light?
Well, you mean that perhaps you could tell the audience what what you think I'm doing or what I'm doing? Or she wants to do that?
Yeah, we would love to do that. We actually learned about your work. So you actually weren't the one who made the discovery, but you blew the whistle on this class of enzyme deficiencies known as the cytochrome P450. And so we talked about it on our show with, we had Elaine Danneman on, but we wanted to bring you on because we wanted to get your expertise as a forensic psychiatrist. And so that's, I think, where we wanted to start, was just talking about your background and how you, what a forensic psychiatrist is, and then how you came to find out about this.
Okay. I am a doctor, medical doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. I have a doctorate in public health, but nobody seems to worry too much about that in Australia. I discovered, when on returning to public sector work in about 1979, that at least 1/3 of the admissions to a psychiatric ward were from people having side effects to these new drugs. And they were coming in with suicidal thoughts. They were aggressive. They'd been assaulting people and that sort of thing. And this was completely new. And it really hit me because I had been away from public sector psychiatry for the 4 or 5 years since Prozac. The first of these drugs had been introduced, so I was able to see it very clearly. And because of my other studies in public health about doctor-created diseases, a doctor-created disease called cumulative trauma disorder, repetitive strain injury, I was pretty soon able to see what was going on. But why, I didn't understand, and that took a long time. These drugs, there are many drugs, many medicines that have medication-induced suicide as a side effect, but the most prominent ones are the antidepressants and new antipsychotics. But there are many, many more. And what we couldn't, and we knew about the epidemiology of suicide on antidepressants. It's at least doubled, if not trebled. But who and why some people who become suicidal and why they become suicidal was still a bit of a mystery. And I wasn't really able to do very much about that until the United States Food and Drug Administration started an education program, and then I caught on fairly quickly. Yeah.
So I also want to know, could you explain to our viewers what exactly a forensic psychiatrist is?
Well, forensic is a word that comes from the Latin forens, the forum, which is where the law courts were. So a forensic psychiatrist works at the interface of psychiatry and the law. A forensic anthropologist works on the interface of anthropology and the law. Forensic pathologist works on the interface of pathology and the law. Okay. So it's about the law, really. It's public.
Interesting. Huh. And because I was listening to one of your lectures, and I thought it was really interesting because I think you made a comment about that you really didn't think too highly of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and I wanted to know what your thoughts on it are, and if you find it helpful in particular.
Well, it was, the DSM-3 was an attempt by psychiatry to say that psychiatry is the treatment of diseases like the rest of medicine is the treatment of diseases. And they started off with this premise and then defined these so-called disorders by their symptoms. Now, it's all very well for us as psychiatrists or people doing public health to know what we're talking about. The International Classification of Diseases, which is the European system, already did that a lot better. So it was just based on an assumption that here, this list of symptoms is a disorder, and it's totally without theory, totally without cause, and doesn't offer any kind of remedy. So that was DSM-3. On some levels it was welcome because, perhaps we could talk to each other better and say so-and-so has a conversion disorder or something like that.
Oh, basically you were just talking about your thoughts on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and what you thought about it.
Well, I was a psychiatrist before they had a diagnostic and statistical manual, and you knew when people were distressed, and you helped them and you talked them through their problems, and occasionally you got a condition that you could treat with medication, like schizophrenia or biological depression. There are a couple of DSM-1 and DSM-2. Nobody took much notice here in Australia, and DSM-3 arrived with a big fanfare and 300-odd new disorders. Psychiatry at that stage was trying very hard to pretend that it was just like medicine, and we could treat these disorders, as they called them, which is becoming unhappy when things are sad for you, or becoming anxious when you've got a lot of worries, are somehow disorders and real things that could be treated with pills. And, of course, there was an unholy relationship between the American Psychiatric Association, the pharmaceutical industry, and while these disorders were being created, the drug companies were busy finding people who had some of these criteria and testing pills. So that was the start of it. Now, we jump forward from 1980, there have been a few DSM-3s and a DSM-4, which increased the number of so-called disorders. The DSM-5 has increased it again, but indeed taken a lot of detail out, and in fact taken out knowledge while allowing psychiatry to claim therapeutic jurisdiction over treating a lot of things, a lot of conditions and a lot of behaviours that it cannot influence. So the only real use for a DSM in the United States is for insurance purposes, so the doctor can say, I treated this person for an obsessive-compulsive disorder, or I treated this person for a major depressive disorder, but it means nothing really.
Right. And so what, one of the other things that you talked about during your lecture that Virstyne mentioned was something called akathisia. So what is that, and is this sometimes sort of what you were talking about, how they maybe misdiagnose depression or something like that? Could it be misdiagnosed as this akathisia?
It's a Greek word. It means I can't sit down. It's a side effect of medication most commonly. However, it also occurs after epidemics of encephalitis lethargica, and sometimes you see it in Parkinson's disease, and very rarely you see it with a brain injury. But there's something wrong with the brain of a person that has akathisia, as opposed to mental illness, where there's something wrong with the mind, the way the mind works. I mean schizophrenia and biological depression. I don't mean being just worried. That's quite normal. Anyway, so akathisia is a very nasty side effect, and in the DSM-4, since 1992, it has been called neuroleptic and SSRI-induced akathisia. It's associated with restlessness, feeling absolutely awful. The word is dysphoria. It's also associated with committing suicide, committing violence, committing homicide. It's a toxic state, so you see hallucinations and delusions. And because the brain is in such a mess, awash with all these chemicals, you have all sorts of behavioral disturbances, which can be minor or fairly major. So that's in the DSM-4. But let me tell you about DSM-5. It's now called medication-induced akathisia, which is progress. There's lots of drugs that cause it, not only psychiatric drugs. It is acute, which means it happens fairly quickly after the drug, or tardive in DSM-5, which means occurs late. So they don't talk about the chronic akathisia, and they don't talk about the withdrawal akathisia, and they don't talk about the akathisia that starts up to 3 months after you've taken these drugs, when you've been reasonably well for a while. And they do not talk about suicide or aggression or violence or behavioral discontrol. So they've taken all that out in order, I think, to cover it up. I can only think that they've covered it up. It's a very, very nasty side effect which occurs in possibly in, well, it's dose dependent, so it occurs in according to the old DSM, 25 to 75% of people who are using these drugs. And it depends among all sorts of things, but it depends on local prescribing habits. And local prescribing habits in Australia are absolutely horrific. It's not unusual for me to find somebody who's on 16 times the smallest dose of a drug and on 2 or 3 other drugs at once. So it's dose dependent, which means that if your blood levels go up above a certain level, above the therapeutic window of opportunity, you're likely to get akathisia. And everybody will get akathisia at high doses. But it's the people who get it at low doses that are interesting, because they're the ones that have the genetic problem, which is the non-metabolizing problem. And the other thing that's interesting about the genetic problem is why some people can take a certain drug, a certain dose, or certain combinations, and other people can't. And they have the akathisia and other side effects on certain drugs and combinations. And that is where, if you do the gene test, that's the invisible factor that differentiates those who can take the drug from those who can't take the drug. Could disorders such as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, restless leg syndrome be mislabeled versions of akathisia? Restless legs very often occur in akathisia. The other two are syndromes, and if you get somebody who has chronic fatigue, you have to spend a lot of time diagnosing them, because there's a lot of them that actually have physical disorders that have as yet been undiagnosed. Akathisia is always related to medication, and most people with chronic fatigue syndrome, the other one you mentioned, aren't on this kind of medication. Certainly people with akathisia can say they have fatigue that ropes you to the bed, is what they tell me. And they have sudden urges to do things, and they'll get up and clean the house madly for half an hour and then collapse. So you've got this, this chemically induced instability. But the core of it is a feeling of violence, which turns into suicide if you turn it on to yourself, and homicide if you turn it on to others, or even mass homicide. If you look at all the school shootings, they're all people on akathisia-inducing medications, all of them.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question for you, because we don't see it here in the U.S. ever. Like you said, they're always on these types of akathisia-inducing drugs. Is that also the case in Australia? Like, is it as prevalent there as it is here?
Look, I don't know. I've seen about 700 cases in my medico-legal practice. For all I know, everybody else out there is perfectly okay, but it's highly unlikely because they come in at 2 or 3 a week. It's just poorly recognized. We don't have the massive school shootings that you have because we have gun control. But we do have, every day you see somebody who's killed his children or massacred the family, and they're being, inverted commas, treated for mental illness, close inverted commas. But no, the paper never tells you what they're taking, and I tell you something, they don't want to know. Nobody wants to know. We have fairly awful form of press control here, in that, in theory, the press is free, but there's an organisation called Mindframe which indicated to the press how suicide and how violence and how mental illness should be treated, and it's a bit like yours. You don't get the name of the drug in the paper.
Right. And so a lot of these, homicides and suicides and things that you're talking about are connected to SSRI drugs.
Yes.
And so, so can you explain what those are to our audience, and then how those induce akathisia?
Okay. Well, how they do it is a bit of a mystery. We don't really know how they do it. The SSRI drugs are the modern antidepressants. They're Prozac, Serza, Nifazodone, I think, has been withdrawn, Effexor, Celexa, Lexapro. You don't have fluvoxamine there. That's a bad one. Zoloft. They're those drugs. the drugs doctors give out for depression. And what happens here, and I'm pretty sure it happens overseas as well, because, the very half a dozen overseas clients I've talked to, if they hallucinate on an SSRI, the doctor, who's pretty naive, thinks, oh, this person must be schizophrenic, and they whack in another drug, like Zyprexa, or Risperdal, or Seroquel, and they're all akathisia inducers as well, twice as bad as the antidepressants. So then you get this chronic state of weird behaviors, weird mental state, and well, they've got to cover it up somehow, and they call it treatment refractory schizophrenia. But in fact, it's not a schizophrenia at all. It's a chronic state of drug side effects, usually associated with a bad gene or two.
Mm. Yeah, so any of these SSRI drugs, are they ever safe or necessary for somebody to take? And then if so, how would one know if they would be able to metabolize them properly?
Okay, well, what they're given for is the minor mental disorders. Somebody's upset, or there's been a bereavement. Here, most of my clients had them given to them for work stress or because they had an injury and were already on painkillers. And doctors imagine that they're a sort of cheer you up drug. And they don't work. That's pretty well known now. They're known as the Emperor's New Drugs. They may work in 1 person in 10 in the clinical trials. That means you've got to treat 10 people before you get 1 positive response. So it's absolutely no use treating the minor mental disorders with this, because the person's in a bad predicament. The pill doesn't make the predicament go away. Their mental state doesn't change, and they're quite likely to get side effects. However, there is a condition that was removed from the DSM in 1980. I don't know why it was removed, called biological depression or melancholia. And these are the really serious depressions, and they're the ones that you have to treat. Now, the old antidepressants worked pretty well on those, unless you got a patient who was a poor metabolizer, and they had the same. They developed akathisia and some committed suicide. But if you watched and warned, gave the drug in small doses to ensure that the person could metabolize it, increased it and talked people up through doing psychotherapy by reminding them of really good periods in their lives, they'd leave your office feeling much, much better. And these people get better. The serious depressions got better on the old antidepressants. Now, I don't know if the serious depressions were not the ones they were trialed on. I don't know. I don't see those cases anymore. I see a lot of people who say, oh, this drug is saving my life. And you go through it with them, and they'll tell you, no, they have suicide impulses every night. They have every day. They have weird dreams, weird nightmares with blood and guts and people chasing them, sometimes weird sexual nightmares. Their libido is 0. They haven't had sex for years. They're losing their relationships. And you say, well, why on earth do you think this drug's doing you any good? And they say, oh, I know, because if I miss a tablet, all the depression comes back. I say, yeah, but who's told you that's the depression coming back? That is the withdrawal state. If you withdraw suddenly, these drugs have a withdrawal reaction. And if you withdraw from the drug suddenly, you're going to get suicidal and depressed. And if you decide that you want to come off it, then you have to come off it very, very, very slowly. I mean, as slowly as you can afford to come off it. And they say, oh, I was told it was the depression coming back, and that's why I think this drug is so marvelous for me.
Yeah.
So it's as if they've been stitched up, absolutely stitched up.
Right. Yeah, and so that's interesting that you put it that way, because it's not really that the drug is helping them, it's that coming off of it is so bad that they think that it's helping them when they try to.
That's right.
So, yeah, so recently I read an abstract from 2002 on PubMed that was talking about SSRIs, and it says it actually inhibits the cytochrome P450, which we'll get to in a moment, but it actually inhibits it, so it basically makes it impossible for some people to metabolize it. So in other words, like if you're not you could be a non-metabolizer to begin with, but even if you're not, it might actually prevent you from being able to metabolize it. And then, so that's where I was saying, are you familiar with this study? And if so, can you explain a little bit more about what they're talking about?
With the cytochrome P450, you may have a full complement of them. I've only seen 3 people with a full complement of CYP450s, but then we haven't tested those for the other CYPs yet. These drugs are metabolized by one or other CYP preferentially, and they also, all of them inhibit one or more CYPs. So you've got 2 things going on. You've got the genetic problem and you've got the inhibition problem. If you've got the genetic problem, then the blood levels rise and they become stronger and stronger inhibitors. So, and this was taught to me by a Russian scientist. She did her doctorate in Moscow over 30 years ago, about cytochrome P450. And with antidepressants, it doesn't really matter which cytochrome is impaired, genetically impaired, because they inhibit one or more. So anybody who's already got one allele out of 6 impaired is going to have more alleles out of 6 inhibited. And so as you take more and more of the drug, its metabolism slows even further. And it sort of spirals out of control.
So, could you tell us a little bit, probably have to go back a little bit, but how did you discover the mutation in cytochrome P450, and exactly what is it and who should be tested for it?
Okay. I don't do it. This is a laboratory matter. It comes out of the Human Genome Project, and it used to be that people tested for ability to metabolize by giving people probe drugs, P-R-O-B-E, probe drugs. They would give them coffee and then measure the levels of caffeine, or give them a cough mixture called dibrizoquine and measure the levels of dibrizoquine. They found that there were some people who couldn't metabolize dibrizoquine, and they called it the dibrizoquine enzyme. And then I think in the early 80s, the Karolinska Institute, which gives out the Nobel Prizes in Sweden, got onto it, and they have a website, and there's an official nomenclature, and now what was known as the dibrizoquine enzyme is known as 2D6, and that's the one we know most about. Basically, we look at 3 of them. They're called 2D6, 2C9, and 2C19, and we're now being able to look at 1A2 and 3A4. But these are commercial tests. They're done in a laboratory with an auto-analyzer, and they can actually look at the gene and look at the order in which the amino acids occur. And if they occur in the normal order, it's a star 1. If they occur in different orders, they have different numbers.
And so that could that indicate the level of their ability to metabolize? So it's like, so what you're saying, if they're appearing in different numbers, like, I don't know, I haven't seen the test results yet, but I'm assuming that, like, 1 would be, maybe mild.
No. No, they all have names. There's star 1, star 2, star 3, star 75. And each one of those has a different level of metabolism. But that's, and, in theory, some of them are non-metabolizer alleles and some of them are poor metabolizer alleles, but in practice it doesn't really matter, because with antidepressants they're inhibited. So you've got a situation where these alleles may be normal but inhibited, or maybe a little bit abnormal and turned into poor metabolizer by the drug. It's a system you can look at and understand. I tell you, I was teaching my own doctor about this the other day because he's got a difficult patient. And I said, imagine this. Imagine that you've got a very dirty factory floor. And there's water spilling on it, dirty water, oil, benzene, mud, dust, right? So you've got a real mess.
Yeah.
And you've got your metabolizing system, which is a whole series of mops. And you've got one mop called 2D6, and that is a really, really efficient mop. It'll pick up water, but it's a small mop. It's very, very small. So after you've got too much of a 2D6 drug, the water just keeps flowing out on the factory floor. You can't mop it up. So the others try to mop it up. And when they try to mop it up, 2C9, for example, is very good at mopping up oil because it's a detergent-soaked mop. But it's not much good with water, but at a pinch it'll pick some up. 2C9, say, is good for picking up dust and benzene, but it's not much good for water, but at a pinch will pick it up. 3A4, which is the zinc enzyme, is a great big mop, very ragged and very inefficient, but eventually it'll pick everything up. But if you throw some oil into the system, you can block all those mops. You can make them utterly useless. Oil's your inhibitor. Now, that's the model I was using to try to explain it to my doctor, that they're all interreacted, they all interact, they all pick up one or other drug preferentially, but will do the rest at a pinch. And in theory, you should be able to find, although 40% of the although most of the population has a mutation, you should be able to find the right drug at the right dose for all of them, for pretty much all of them. You can't find the right drug and the right dose for somebody who has 6 out of 6 alleles mutated. We're looking at 3 genes, 6 alleles.
Right. So that's what you would be, that when you say the non-metabolizers, those are the non-metabolizers. Who's 6 out of 6, they just don't do it. And so when I talked to you a few weeks ago, I had mentioned to you that I had a son with autism, and I kind of suspected that he might be a non-metabolizer, or at least a very poor metabolizer, because he's very sensitive to medications and even vitamins or sometimes food. And so I was kind of interested in getting him tested just because in this country we're seeing kind of a push towards putting a lot of our children, especially if they have a disability or neurological disorder, putting them on medications like Risperdal, for example, for autism. That's one of the ones that's used, one of the more commonly ones that's used. And so and in some cases, you know, parents are trying to say, well, no, we don't really feel comfortable with this, we don't really want to do this, but then the state is coming in and kind of forcing them to do it, or they're taking their children away. They're using, you know, forces like here it's called Child Protective Services. So have you seen this kind of, are you familiar with that, and have you seen this sort of thing in Australia as well?
Well, yes, they do, but they do exactly that, but not quite as brutally as they do in the US. But just let me tell you about autism and Risperdal. Risperdal is approved for behavioral disturbances in autism, right? It means it's approved to use as a cosh. Do you have that word there? A cosh, a baton, to knock out a kid who's behaving badly. It is not a treatment for autism. There is no treatment for autism, right? Now, to say that the drug is approved for that purpose, you've got to go back to United States Food and Drug Administration regulations. The drug company making Risperdal can create as many clinical trials as it wants to, and as soon as it's got 2 in which the drug was better than a sugar pill, that drug has to be approved. So the fact that a drug is approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration doesn't mean that it's either safe or effective. It just means that the sponsor has found 2 trials where it's better than sugar pills. Now, Risperdal for children is an interesting thing because it wasn't approved for children for any use whatsoever for a very long time, and it certainly wasn't approved for children while David Kessler, who was a pediatrician, was chief commissioner for the United States Food and Drug Administration. He gave evidence in a recent case against Risperdal, against the makers of Risperdal, for fraudulently promoting the drug for children. And the information is available on the net. You have to Google for it. And basically, he resisted it because it had the same profile in children as it did in adults, which is that it killed more than 1% of the clinical trial subjects. Yes, and it's still doing that with the children. And anyway, as soon as David Kessler went away, the FDA wrote this smarmy letter to Janssen saying, this is how you can do it, this is how you can get your drug approved. So then Janssen came back with clinical trials done three or four patients in each country from multi-local clinical trials, and said, here, in these we have positive responses in these, and no one committed suicide. Okay? Well, great. So the drug had to be approved. Well, the reason that no one committed suicide is that in clinical trials they're watched like hawks. They're interviewed daily, they're warned, and if they become suicidal, they're pulled out. So no one commits suicide in the clinical trials. But they certainly do in the community, because they're not told this drug is intensely suicidogenic for some people, and you have to watch them and warn them. And, you know, and you have to get informed consent from the parents to do this. So that's your story of Risperdal. There was a case, the makers of Risperdal have paid hundreds of millions in fines, even $1.2 billion in Arizona for fraudulent promotion. The federal case, they had an award of $2.2 billion against them for this sort of thing, and that went on appeal, because the jury got the summary of the trials, the warning from Janssen, as instead of the original clinical trial data. And I suppose I don't think we've heard the end of that. But it's playing silly buggers out there with people's lives.
Oh yeah, well, right now there's a class action suit going on for Risperdal because it's been discovered to make boys grow breasts.
That's right.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. These drug companies have enormous power in the United States, because they give billions of dollars to people in Congress and the Senate on both sides of the aisle, so nobody dares say a word against them.
Oh, yeah, and plus we had a pharmaceutical rep on our show, and she was talking that they know, too, that they don't really care because they know they're going to make more money from the drugs, and they put aside a little money just to pay the people off anyway, because they know they don't have the money to go up against their lawyers, so it's terrible.
They just regard these fines as a cost of doing business. It's a good business plan.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Until they get charged with corporate homicide, which is really very necessary. I mean, Risperdal and Zyprexa are the worst drugs for akathisia, suicide, and violence, the worst. And yet they're both blockbusters for their makers.
Wow.
Now, I guess the parents of a kid who's taken into care, you know, well, how are they going to sue them?
Right. Right. And that's true, and that's a big thing in this country, too, is that a lot of the kids that are in care under the CPS or the foster care system are drugged. It's like much higher than children that are in their natural home. It's something like 80%, or it's really ridiculously high.
It's stupid. But it's a result of President Bush's Mind Freedom program. I mean, it's an advertising. It's a business. It's hideous.
Right. Yeah, it is, and it's and when I listened to the lecture that Virstyne mentioned earlier, and you were talking mostly about drugs, but you even talked about some herbal supplements that can be sort of can promote akathisia, and you mentioned St. John's wort, and I think it was, and valerian root, and and I've seen this in my own son, his own reactions to sometimes natural things. We took the anti-inflammatory quercetin, and he had what I think you might say would look like akathisia. He would become very restless, hyperactive, and in some cases aggressive. He doesn't have the motor planning capacity to plan something. For him, violence looks more like that of a toddler. I mean, he would kind of pinch or, give you a squeeze or something like that. It wouldn't be, something elaborately planned. But I've seen that, and it's not from drugs. It's from like natural herbal supplements. So what is it that happens in the mind when somebody goes on St. John's wort or valerian or something like that?
I'm not sure that valerian causes akathisia, but it blocks all the cytochromes. So it's really dangerous to give somebody who's having valerian an antidepressant. Very, very dangerous. But doctors don't know that. St. John's wort is known as liquid Prozac. It's essentially an SSRI, and it has exactly the same side effects. As well as that, it induces, I've seen people being given antidepressants on top of St. John's wort, and if they stop the St. John's wort or miss a dose, the antidepressant level goes up and they get into terrible trouble.
And so, and then myself too, like I mean, another reason that I was kind of curious about my son is because I'm also very sensitive, and I've had reactions to, I've never been on any antidepressants, but I've been on, antibiotics, painkillers, birth control, and I can't tolerate it. After a few days, my body, I just feel it wrong, and I stop taking it. And so is this in the same class of sort of enzyme deficiencies, or is this different?
Cytochrome P450 metabolizes many drugs, including some of the ones you've mentioned, which are birth control pills, hormones, sometimes anti-inflammatories, certainly, and some antibiotics. Tetracyclines like Roaccutane can also cause akathisia and suicide and homicide. In fact, the Roaccutanes had to be withdrawn because there were so many suicides and homicides on it. Now, that's a tetracycline. Long-term of any tetracycline can cause this problem. It runs in families, obviously, because it's genetic. Means half your genes are with your son. And certainly, I would say, on your history, you have you have some polymorphisms, you have some mutations, The test is a bit of a racket. The best one in the United States is GeneLex, and they're about somewhere between 600 and 700, and you get a very good report. Other people charge $3,500 for a test, and they get away with it. In Australia, we have a very efficient system, and I can get them done for $150 from cheek swabs sent by snail mail. Well, not snail mail, but they don't have to be just ordinary standard airmail. They don't have to be through any customs or anything. Just dry the cheek swabs, put them in an envelope, clean envelope, and send them with a request. It has to be signed by a doctor. I can always send out signed requests. That's not a problem. So it's a very cheap test to run. It probably costs about $5 for the ingredients and $15 to run. And it's an auto-analyzer, so you put the swab in at one end and a report comes out at the other. But it's a bit of a racket at the moment. Drug companies don't want us to know about pharmacogenetics. We wouldn't have had the Vioxx problems if we'd known about pharmacogenetics. They don't want to know until they can exploit it. And in a few years, there's going to be a huge push from drug companies to do genetic testing. You can predict it. When there's a buck in it for them, they'll be there.
Good old big pharma. You know. So in your interview, you did an interview with Clint Richardson. In the interview, you were talking about the cases of violence were no different among those with schizophrenia than the normal population.
That's right. Until we started treating schizophrenia with drugs that cause akathisia, and that was about the early 50s when we started treating with chlorpromazine. Before that, people with schizophrenia had the same homicide and suicide rates as the normal population. Certainly you see delusional schizophrenia causing homicide, but then that's more than equaled by hitmen in the normal population. So the rates were much the same. But when we started giving them drugs that have akathisia as a side effect, people with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses started to become very violent. And there's only a very small proportion of the population suffers from schizophrenia. It's something less than 1%. But you in the United States have like 1 in 6% of the population on schizophrenia drugs. So they've been put on the rest have been put on schizophrenia drugs for something like drug-induced psychosis or medication-induced hallucinations. So you've got tremendous lot of violence out there caused by medication, which wasn't there before we had the medication. You see, some people who develop akathisia will kill themselves, and some people who develop akathisia will kill others. So it stands to reason that the number of homicides and suicides will go up with the number of akathisia drugs out there.
Right. And so, I read that you testified in court on these akathisia-inducing drugs, and that while the judge favored on the side of your testimony, he reprimanded you and then told you to seek psychiatric help. What happened there?
First of all,
what actually transpired?
Very inaccurate. Yes, that's absolutely untrue, and it's still out there on the internet. What happened was I had returned to public sector psychiatry, and after I was noticing all this and trying to draw attention to it by going to the right people in the administration and to my colleagues, and some of them were taking a lot of notice, but the person in charge wasn't taking any notice. And then he put a very good friend of his to work next to me, and this doctor was causing 2 suicide attempts a week, right? And I tried to talk to him in every reasonable way, and eventually what happened wasn't me. I had disagreed with the boss, whom I mentioned earlier, on the diagnosis of 2 very young people, 16, 17-year-olds, who were on drugs, who were given Arapax paroxetine, which is your Paxil. And they had become suicidal on it. Now, Paxil has since been banned in the United Kingdom. It's subject to a black box warning about suicidality and hallucinations and akathisia and so on for children. I had disagreed, and they had complained about me to the authorities. And the authorities refused to believe that Paxil caused these problems. The College of Psychiatrists says we don't believe the black box warning. We don't believe the United States Food and Drug Administration. We don't believe that antidepressants cause suicide. Well, they don't read the product information. They don't believe it if they do. Anyway, so then I started reporting this bloke's suicide attempts and completed suicides. And I reported 32 cases, and the authorities, who were in fact being, advised by the person who was, as I said, I called him the boss, he's their chief advisor, took me before a tribunal. And it was a professional standards committee. The psychiatrist on the committee, I happen to know, knows nothing about this, and what chance would the lawyer and the social worker have? And I presented these cases, and they got peer reviewers who said she doesn't know what she's talking about. Antidepressants don't have any side effects. Zyprexa doesn't have any side effects or interactions. It was, really, really probably one of the more ignorant psychiatrists that I've ever met. Now, this regulator, the health of the community depends on the regulator, because the regulator's responsibility is to public health, right? So if there are public health problems, the regulator's supposed to pick them up. Well, this regulator's very stubborn, refused to see a public health problem. I've since sent 300 in, and they still don't see a public health problem, because according to their advisors, this doesn't happen. Anyway, the committee was pretty nasty and disagreed with my diagnosis and disagreed with my telling a mother that her son had akathisia, not schizophrenia, although it led to his complete cure. And they said that I had to go and see a colleague about my diagnosis. So I went to see a colleague, and he said, Yolande, you're perfectly right, that this is nonsense. So, okay. But then the press got hold of it. The press talked to somebody at the regulator, and the press put in the paper that I had been ordered into treatment by the medical board. I immediately wrote to them and said, this is wrong. I've recently had on a subpoena learned from subpoena that the regulator took this press cutting, which they knew was wrong and they knew they had planted there, and sent it to 15 area health directors, right? So they absolutely criminally defamed me. This is all in litigation at the moment. They criminally defame me, but you see, they're protected. They're not allowed to be charged with defamation, but we'll see. And the whole goal of this was to keep me out of the courts. Because every time I go into a courtroom, it costs the health department or some insurer a lot of money because I win cases. Right, but they're different courts. Anyway, the Supreme Court, I went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. There was another case, and I'm not allowed to talk about that. It was very nasty, but I'm not allowed to talk about that. Anyway, in the end, the Supreme Court of Appeal removed the findings of a tribunal. It was another tribunal. I wasn't allowed to treat psychotic patients unless I was supervised for 3 years. That's run out now, but the regulator refuses to take it off their website. So really, the whole thing has been, because I'm a whistleblower, to keep me out of the courtrooms. Absolutely to keep me out of the courtrooms and to protect themselves and to protect the Department of Health.
Well, yeah.
Very, very nasty. So anyway, that's the reason I've done all this research, because I haven't been doing very much work. Oh, and this homicides paper, the paper that I had published about antidepressant akathisia homicides with diminishing mutations in the CYP450 family, that had been published, and the regulator gets a psychiatrist who wouldn't even be able to pronounce cytochrome, she's never heard of them, to say it's absolute nonsense. And a few weeks ago, there was an inquest, a coronial inquest, where 2 of my colleagues got up and said I was talking nonsense. That's just the way they behave here. Not very nice, is it?
No, but you know what? They do that here in America. We've interviewed doctors that have come out with information that, to try to help the human species, but, it shines the light poorly on Big Pharma. They're always, bullied or attempted to be discredited or even, have their life threatened. So.
Well, that's happened to me. And I was hearing from my friends that the drug reps who were promoting these drugs to doctors in their offices were telling them that she's mad, she's mad. Well, I'm not.
Yeah, no, we know you're not. Yeah.
You're not. Yeah, by talking to you, you're clearly not. But that's just how they're trying to defame your character.
Well,
so that people
very successful here so far. Very, very successful, and it's very, very unpleasant.
Yeah, I know. You made a quote on the lecture I listened to. I thought it was really interesting. It was from the Senior Vice President of Genetics for GlaxoSmithKline, and you said he had been quoted as saying that 90% of drugs work in 30 to 50% of people.
That's correct.
Would you care to comment on that? Because I just thought that was...
Well, that's absolutely right, but our product information here is very, very short compared with your product information. And the problem, it took me a long time to work out where my problem was coming from, but I had got onto the website of the United States Food and Drug Administration where the American product information exists, and I was diagnosing all these side effects. And my colleagues were using Australian product information, which is about a quarter the size, and they were saying, and this was the result, this sort of happened in these tribunals, where their experts said, this doesn't happen. Now, it doesn't happen if you look at Australian product information, but it's all in American product information. For instance, Effexor has homicidal ideation among its listed side effects. There's also a condition which is unique to drug company jargon. It says emotional lability. That actually means suicidal ideation. All these drugs have suicidal thinking and suicide attempts among their listed side effects in the United States, and none of them has it in Australia. So I'm regarded as nuts because they don't know where my knowledge is coming from. It's very unpleasant. But on the other hand, I'm such a Pollyanna. If I had been still working at the rate I was working 10 years ago, I wouldn't have had time to do the research. I wouldn't have had time to do the publishing. So, in fact, if you believe in karma, and I don't particularly do, then, then I've turned the disadvantage into an advantage, at least an advantage for the community. Oh, look, by the way, I'm not the only one saying this. The drug companies have been saying it for years. I stand on the shoulders of giants, drug company giants. So, you
had another quote I thought was really cool. You said it was from the Canadian Dr. William Osler, and it was, listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis. And my observation is that, doctors become doctors to help people. But, when you bring up things that can help their patients, it's been my observation that, they become so detached from their patients, especially when they're trying to diagnose them, that they forget to listen to them. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Medicine's changed. I mean, I've been a doctor. It's my 50-year reunion this year. I've been a doctor for nearly 50 years. And it's changed. I mean, it used to be a vocation. I mean, people who went into medicine because they wanted to help people. Now they go into medicine because that's where the money is. It's just completely changed. It's almost unbearable to watch.
Right. Well, a lot of them go into it because of the money, and then they go into debt. At least in this country, it costs, I don't know about Australia, but people who go into medical school in the United States find themselves in the ballpark of, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt once they're finished with medical school, and so then they're kind of like enslaved to the job at that point. So I don't know. It's like she said, then they become detached to the patient because it's all about stacking the patients and getting so many in so that they can make enough money. So that's unfortunate, but we appreciate you being on the show to talk about this today. We are just about out of time, but it's been a pleasure, and I really think that what you're doing is going to shed some light onto a lot of these things that people aren't quite understanding as far as, like, why we're so sick. I mean, in this country for sure, probably in Australia too, you're seeing just an epidemic of people just with problems. And they're all on drugs and they're all seeing doctors, but yet they're still unhealthy. And so I think you're kind of like hitting the problem a lot here. Yeah. So I appreciate that. And I want to, before we let you go, I want to everybody to be able to look up your work. So what's the best way? I didn't see that you had a website, but what's the best way for people to find it?
Your website has crashed, and I can't seem to get the people to put it up again. They're American. I keep trying, but it's Lucire Dove Homicides. Lucire, Lucire, Dove, it's Dove Press, D-O-V-E, Homicides, H-O-M-I-C-I-D-E-S. On Google will come to me giving a lecture on YouTube and also the most important recent paper. I've got another one in the pipeline. Yeah. It's really sad that the regulators should, a regulator of medical practice should side so much with the drug companies, though, isn't it?
Yes.
I believe the California Medical Board was sacked because they couldn't deal with this problem. I can't wait.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. I mean, it is funny how you said, your information is being backed by what the pharmaceutical companies are already telling you. They've been telling you this for years. It's like, but they talk out of both sides of their mouths because I don't know if I don't think these are legal in Australia, but here in the United States they have these commercials where they sell these drugs and they're saying, take Prozac and it's going to help your depression, and they show these people, depressed, and then they're outside riding a bike and they look like they're all healthy and happy, and then they list the side effects, and one of the things they'll tell you is suicide, homicidal thoughts, all these horrible things, but you think, well, if I'm depressed, isn't this worse? Yeah. Wouldn't it be worse to be suicidal and homicidal? But, the side effect is worse than what they're trying to treat.
It's sort of cognitive dissonance. I can't understand why you would give a child who's not concentrating in the classroom a drug that might make them homicidal. They actually come out of it with post-traumatic stress disorder caused by their own mind. It's quite horrible. There's a sort of cognitive dissonance there. I mean, if you say it loud enough and often enough and nobody reacts, you must think, oh, well, it's normal to give somebody an antidepressant that might make them suicidal. Oh, and because they didn't commit suicide in the clinical trials, it doesn't really matter. Well, you know, in the clinical trials, they're pulled out when they're suicidal. They're not in the community.
Right. So it's deceptive, because then
and there are what we call key opinion leaders, and they appear all over the world, in the UK, in the USA, and these are people who get literally millions of dollars from drug companies to be willfully blind to this, and they've got incredible positions of power here. They advise the regulators, they create policies like Beyond Blue, you know, which allows Pfizer to go tell GPs what sort of things these drugs can be given for. They don't talk about side effects. They create clinical practice guidelines. They create programs like Your Mind Freedom to get as many children as possible onto medication on the basis that it might prevent them from becoming psychotic, but it does exactly the opposite. It's quite amazing how they get away with it. I mean, you just need to shine the light of common sense on it, and it will go away. But I think if a lot of people are being paid money, and we don't know how much people in our government are being paid by companies like Medicines Australia, other drug company fronts, we don't know that. So we're having much the same debate here as you are over there, whether people who are in government should be being paid by corporations. You know, we used to think that Australian governments govern for the people and yours govern for the corporations. But at the moment, we've got some crises on that makes us wonder who they're governing for.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's true. It's cognitive dissonance that people don't really get it, and it's kind of Orwellian too. It's like the opposite of what we're being told is what's actually going on. You know.
Google to safety pharmacogenomics psychiatry. You'll get 33 million hits. Here, my colleagues and the regulators treat what I'm saying as if it's a figment of my imagination.
Right. Well, we know it's not, because it's so obvious what you're saying is happening, and it's like real in front of people's face. So if they don't see it, then that is what you described as cognitive dissonance. They just they're tuned out to it. They just don't get it. It is sad, but we appreciate you and your work a lot, and thanks for being on the show today. And again, Dr. Yolande Lucire, you can Google her. The website's not up yet, but we'll put the show link anyway, just in case it gets up by the time the show airs. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate it.
Bye.
Everything I'm looking at seems crazy. The newspaper, the television, nothing's right. Nothing's telling me what's true. It's like I fell into a bucket of cream and kicked my legs until I became a mouse. What's that about? I'm a conspiracy realist, not a conspiracy theorist. I want a t-shirt that represents me. What? There's one that's available? Go to shop.truthertease.com, says the voice in my head. Shop.truthertease.com. It's not crazy. I'm not afraid to go on the internet and go to shop.truthertease.com. I'm not scared. I've taken out bowling balls that look like you. That's what I said. Straighten out. Get your conspiracy realist t-shirt. Don't make me come over there. You look good. You look good.
Hey, welcome back. Thanks for listening to Truth or Talk. So we just interviewed Dr. Yolande Lucire out of Australia. And that was a really dense conversation. She had a lot of information to give us about the science behind these drugs and like how they affect the body. And so I hope everybody was able to follow. It was, I mean, even in moments I was kind of like, okay, I need to be taking some notes here because this is heavy kind of information. But it was, I think,
maybe you can put her. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, yeah.
You can put her link to her lecture on YouTube, so you can she gave a lecture somewhere, I don't remember where. If you guys want to look at that too, because when it comes to the medical stuff, I think it's a little bit easier only when you've been like reading it or researching it for a while. But if you're just getting into this stuff, it's like it makes your brain go nuts. So you gotta listen to stuff and it over again to just kind of understand. You know, you gotta maybe look at medical terms and stuff that you're not used to hearing. You know, but in the end, it's interesting because you know a lot. You become informed the more you do that. It becomes easier.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And if you're really curious about what she has to say, if you've had an adverse reaction to any of these drugs that she mentioned or any of these things that we talked about, or you don't want to take them and your doctor's recommending it and you're kind of, and you're curious about that, you can find, she has a 35-minute lecture. We'll put the link to that. And then I think she's been on a couple other shows. We got into contact with her because a former guest we had on our show, Brandon Tuberville, who was also, he was on our show, and he was also the ones that, he has a show here on UCY TV as well, Truth on the Tracks, and he interviewed her, and he wrote an article about her work in the Activist Post, I think a couple years ago. So he's been onto this for a while. But when I became aware of it, I brought it to his attention. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that you had written about this and you'd been researching it. And he goes, yeah, and do you want me to get you in touch with the doctor? And so he has an interview with her as well as our former guest that we had on our show, Clint Richardson. He's got a really good interview with the Dr. Lucire as well. So we recommend, if you're really kind of trying to go down that rabbit hole, because it was really hard to fit in everything she had to say in that hour, and it's very dense information, so some of it might just sort of like pass over you or just wash over your head. So just, there's plenty of ways to, and we'll try and give you as many links as possible so you can just really get into it. Because it is, like you said, the medical stuff, the medical side of it can get hard. I mean, it's just hard to, if you're not familiar at all with any of this stuff, it's hard to understand. I think most people respond to anecdotal information about stories about people who have had experiences. And in Dr. We didn't ask her a lot about that, but in her lecture, she gives some anecdotal information of her stories as well, just to illustrate the point about how these things do affect people. And some of the test studies of the people who were working or who did tests for these mutations in their enzyme deficiencies, or their enzyme production, rather. And some of the reactions that they had, and some of them were quite horrifying, were either suicidal or destructive, violent. And, another thing I learned from her, too, which I didn't know, I looked it up later to verify it, and it was correct, was that schizophrenia was not regarded as an illness that, for one, it wasn't regarded as lifelong. It was something that you could get, and then you could reverse it. It was seen as something that you could actually get better. And if you changed your diet and you had some healthy lifestyle changes and things like that, and sometimes you would need some psychiatric help, but it wasn't until they invented the drugs, the antipsychotic drugs that were used to treat schizophrenia, that it actually became associated with violence. That there was no increase of violent behavior in people unless they had been on these antipsychotic drugs. And so, it's also much higher now.
Huh? I was really shocked to hear that. Sorry. We're talking over each other. Yeah. I mean, that's, how people suffer from schizophrenia?
Right. I know. I thought that was just, certain people were crazy. I mean, that was my previous thought of it. And then because I've done so much research on the medical industry for so many years now, that I'm now to the point where I think, open to receiving that information and absorbing it. But it was still surprising to me that it didn't have anything to do with violent behavior. I was like, really? But they're schizophrenic. They're crazy, right? Like, isn't that what that means? And but no, it didn't. And but even before I had known anything about any of this, when I was researching, probably about 6 years ago, and I was researching dietary interventions to help my son with autism, I was reading a book called Breaking the Vicious Cycle, and it outlines the science and how to implement the specific carbohydrate diet. And when I was there's a whole chapter on schizophrenia, and she was saying that there was, I think in the 1950s, a sanitarium that applied this diet to their patients, and a lot of the people with schizophrenia got better. They just got better, you know, and so that was the first time I had heard that people with schizophrenia could get better. I was like, wow, really? You don't just have it for the rest of your life?
Margot Kidder has been outspoken on that, too.
Oh, has she?
Yeah,
what did she say about that?
Yeah, basically what you're saying, but I didn't know, I mean, as far as, like, being able to treat schizophrenia without drugs. But I didn't know the part where it was, you know, before the show, I didn't know the part where you were saying, you guys were talking about, like, how it was curable, you know, until medicine, until the pharmaceutical industry dug its dirty hands, you know, into that situation as well. So.
Yeah, this has been the case of a lot of things. I think that also epilepsy was something that was being treated with diet. It was seizures disorder. For years was you were prescribed a diet. In the 1920s, it was very popular to prescribe the ketogenic diet, which is very, very hard to do. But it works. It was effective at treating epilepsy. People would go on it and they'd stop having seizures. And that was, you know, and then they'd have to stay on it for a period of time or sometimes forever. But that's how it was treated. And then they invented the anti-seizure meds, and then they just forgot to tell people how to go on diet.
Oh, they did not forget.
Yeah.
Oh, whoops, I forgot. Oh, well,
yeah,
drugs, these are better. So they were like, they forgot. Exactly. They intentionally, you know, push that information aside.
Right. It was somehow lost. They were like, whoops, like you lose your keys down. Lose your keys down your car.
You dropped it down a grate in the sewage,
Exactly. They just whoopsies, you know, whoopsie-doos. I lost it. And so they stopped prescribing the drugs. They stopped prescribing the diet. To this day, it's like people are only prescribed the diet as a last resort once the drugs fail. And I've talked to people before who they'll go on 8, 10, 12 different medications, anti-seizure meds that will work for a period of time, maybe to prevent the seizures, and then once they start to fail, the seizures come back worse, and so then they have to put them on another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, and then after they've done all of that, then they start putting them on the diet, and then once the seizures start to go down on their own, they can sort of start to wean them off of the drugs. But then a lot of times the doctors won't let them go off completely. They'll make them stay on a few, just because it's like they just don't trust it. It's weird. I don't know where they got it in their head that, you know, this is the only way to do things from their indoctrination in medical school, perhaps.
Yeah, you know damn well where they...
I know. So the history, we want to do, we want someone to do, I don't know if we have the time to do it, a documentary about, that was your idea, Virstyne, about the history of medicine.
Oh, totally, because the history of allopathic medicine, basically.
Yeah.
And how that came into being before, you know, there was, alternative natural holistic homeopathic medicine, homeopathy. You know, those range, and, you know, they had, you know, people didn't have the types of diseases that they did back then, too, as we see now, before vaccines. Now, there are people that argue, like, well, there were plagues, and there were, you know, that wiped out, like, thousands of people during time, you know, because that's how they fearmonger us into getting vaccinated. But I would attest to the fact that it's because of the hygiene and how people didn't do things like wash their hands. I told my class about Semmelweis, and they were like, ew! So they were so grossed out. It was so funny. But anyway, so stuff like that, and then how people used to, people, so if people like had a pig, right? They killed a pig, they would just throw the carcass out on the street next to their house. In modern society, we have garbage trucks that come and take that away and take it to a junk yard where they incinerate it. So, and then we had horses that were that were just, before cars, there were horses in the street, and they were just pooping the street, and, so they were in a filthy environment that brought a lot of disease. And it's very interesting because if you look at if you look at third world countries that have disease, they all have also very filthy living environments.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, and I think we've talked about that with the HIV narrative, and how it seems to affect certain parts of the world more than others.
But they have poor water. I'm sorry.
No, describe it. You know about this better than I do.
They have poor water systems, Mm-hmm. And what are we, 78 to 80? I've heard figures from about 70 to 80% where water, that's something that we need, we can't live without, but yet the water systems are filthy. So that not only are they drinking dirty water, but they're bathing in dirty water, and they're cooking their food in dirty water, or they barely have any water to begin with, And it's interesting, and smart as Bill Gates is, he seemingly hasn't made that connection. He thinks the way to get these people healthy is to vaccinate them. Where did he get that idea?
You know where he got that idea. You stop it.
I don't know. He's so smart. He's invented the computer technology that we're using right now to do the show. He can't be wrong,
Did he invent it, though?
Did he? I don't know, but he told me he did, so he must be telling me.
Yeah, let's talk to him. Talk to him.
Yeah.
I would love to confront him one day, there was a We Are Change confrontation of Bill Gates, but it wasn't that hard hitting. It's really hard to get to Bill Gates, I think. He just seems like he's well guarded.
It is, and he's guarded, and plus there are a lot of people that are so in love with him that it's like anything he says, they just clap. So it's like if you say anything against him, they'll just like mob you. He'll sneeze and they'll be like, It's ridiculous. Because I remember when Melissa Melton confronted him, and he basically just, he didn't answer her question. He rated her question and twisted it, and basically, and everybody still like clapped. I was like, oh! But I love her for doing that. Like, I thought she was very professional and very ballsy for doing that.
What did she ask him? Do you remember?
It was something, I'm paraphrasing, but she was like, what do you say to people that say that what you're doing with vaccines, and that vaccines is no more than a eugenics agenda? And he was just like, well, vaccines are good for people because it saves the children of the earth. And they were like, yay!
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, it was like something stupid like that. I was like, oh. Somebody needs to find out if he vaccinates his children and get that stuff out or something. He probably doesn't. I know he doesn't.
Well, I mean, he wants to get the medical records on everybody. He wants to be able to trace you via, microchip, so that you can find out when you're due for your next prescription and when you're due for your vaccine. And, what's the latest one he's looking at? Oh, microchip birth control. So you're going to have a birth control, as we had talked about during the intro, birth control is very harmful to your body. This synthetic birth control that's used in the pill, and I had my own personal experience with it, but it's also a hormone disruptor. It ends up in the water. It turned frogs from male to female. It's not good for you. But he wants it distributed to you in a microchip that a woman gets inserted into her body somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but it's like an RFID chip, but it's gonna administer your birth control, because I guess
And you know what? There are people that are going to do it. The people that fall for it because the people are lazy and they don't want to take responsibility and they think that we're evolving. They're going to do it. You know?
Yeah.
Like, oh, look, technology is so interesting. I don't even have to, like, do anything. I could just have this chip in my ovary and, you know, it tells me how many babies to make.
Right, and can you imagine, like, you know, if you get this thing in you, you're not going to be able to, I mean, how are you going to take it out? If you wanted to take it out yourself, you wouldn't be able to do it, right? So you're going to have to go to a doctor and get it taken out. And with the history of eugenics, you know, there's often been cases where women are forcibly sterilized or forcibly. And what if you're, you know, I don't know. What if you don't want it anymore? Or is everyone going to just comply and help you get it out? I don't know, you know, because if Bill Gates has his way, because
Everybody should be microchipped.
Everybody should be microchipped. Everyone should be vaccinated. I doubt he vaccinates his kids. I doubt he takes any of this shit. You know, hell no. Because I don't know. I know his father, the history is his dad was the former head of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood was founded by Margaret Sanger, but everybody knows that. Because she kind of famously came out and said that she founded it because she wanted to rid the world of the Negro problem. And then, he was one of the early on, like, leaders, CEOs that ran it, Bill Gates' father. And, so their history is in eugenics. And by eugenics, I think, a lot of people, or I had someone a while ago kind of tell me that depopulation wasn't real, but eugenics and depopulation are exactly the same. I think because he's pointing out the fact that our population has actually increased, so therefore the evidence doesn't show to a depopulation agenda. It shows that because we're actually increasing. I mean, some argue that it's going to level off and then begin to decrease at some point, that because of the number of children, so the projection is that eventually it will decrease. But it is increasing at the moment, but eugenics and depopulation agenda aren't exactly the same. Eugenics basically means, you know, to try and control who gets to repopulate and who doesn't. So it's kind of like, it's sort of in line with social Darwinism. It's like certain people are going to survive and certain people won't, and we want to kind of create the race that will survive, or you know, mastermind, control and manipulate who is going to be those people. So, you know, it could be like depopulating others while letting others breed. You know, it's just it's basically like a control of that. So, there's a long history of that. That's like no joke. Yeah. That's gone on for many years. And all those guys who were into that shit were all fans of Darwin and liked his style. And thought that he was a genius and smart. So people even today that get into that because they're so wrapped up in the whole anti-religion thing that they don't want to. They believe in Darwinism to a blind eye, but it's mired in its history is in eugenics. Yeah. So when we talk about Bill Gates, you know, I think you can't help but to bring that up because it appears that he has a eugenics agenda. Wouldn't you say?
Yes. Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And he calls people like us. He's Orwellian too, because he calls people like us, you know, baby killers, because he said anyone who participates in anti-vaccine rhetoric kills children. That's what he said. He's like, dude, you're killing children. Yeah. Like, speak for yourself.
Yeah, I'm actually starting to read 1984. Mm-hmm. Did you ever read that? I think even we talked about this off the air.
I think, you know, when I was younger, I don't remember if I read the whole thing. It seems like I picked up the book when I was like 10 or 11, like something weird like that. And then, but I don't remember finishing it. I feel like, but I did start reading it. But yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh no, it's so funny because it's the same thing. It's basically the double speak. Do what I say and not what I do. So.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And exactly. And he's clearly targeting certain areas of the world, and that he wants to vaccinate, and like you pointed out before, that they don't have any clean water, and then these people are coming up with HIV positive a lot of the times, but it's they're not like they don't have clean water, they don't have clean sanitation.
So their immune system is already messed up because
right, and then they're getting vaccines and they're getting drugs and things like that. They don't have as many foods and nutrients as access as we do here in the first world.
Yeah, the soil is messed up too. I forgot about that. But yeah. So yeah. So when that happens too, you're basically what's the word? You're a magnet for disease and parasites to come invade you. Just like in plants. If you think about it that way, you ever you garden, right? So if your plants aren't getting the right nutrition, they become sick or turn yellow, and then they're open to get invaded by parasites and fungus and all that stuff. But if they're getting the right nutrients, they're getting water, they're getting sunlight, they're in a good environment, healthy environment, they're going to grow and be healthy.
Exactly. And so where you don't.
So.
Right. I think it's just common sense. Like, if you think about it, what if you didn't, all of a sudden we didn't have sewer systems and we didn't have plumbing?
First that would be fucking gross. Nasty.
Exactly. It would be nasty, right?
Yeah.
We'd all be just living in filth, and it would be disgusting. And, it's like, so would we be getting sick, or would we be getting healthy in that environment?
Yeah.
I mean, we'd be getting sick, right?
Yeah.
And then, but we're still getting sick, because we're being sold on any little thing, any little problem that we have needs a pill, and so then it ends up making us sicker, and then people are afraid to go off of them. Because I wonder how many times, how often it happens where, like, with Dr. Lucire talking about how certain people can't metabolize them, and then people are unable, and then yet they stay on them, even though they're ignoring, like, the signals of their body, and their body telling them that they're sick, and then they stay on the drugs. I think that happens a lot, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so. I would.
Yeah, because I've actually had family members and stuff that will go on. I don't really know anybody that's taking antidepressants or antipsychotics, but like cholesterol medication and anti-cholesterol medication, which I don't believe in at all, by the way, and I don't believe in the whole cholesterol myth at all, which is a whole other truth to talk, so I won't get into that just yet, but cholesterol is not, necessarily bad for you. So that there's been a whole sham surrounding that. But anyway, but the statin drugs that are supposed to help reduce bad cholesterol are really, really horrible, awful. They will make you sick. They will give you what Dr. Lucire called akathisia. What they do is they deplete your CoQ10 production, and this causes arthritic, joint pain, and weakness in your bodies, and so on and so forth. And my grandma actually went on these drugs. They put her on it for just like a slight elevation in cholesterol. And she said it made her sick, and then she couldn't take walks anymore because she was walking every day, and she felt that it was keeping her weight down, it was keeping her healthy. And after that, she was having so much pain in her hip that she couldn't walk. And so she was like, they told her, oh, don't go off of it. And she said, fuck you, I'm not going off of it. And she went off of it, but I've known others who will stay on it because I think they're just looking for an easier way. Maybe it's they don't want to change their lifestyle, and they know that the other way is much harder, because it would mean changing your diet. It would mean changing, now you're not going to have that donut anymore. because, it's probably making you sick, or I don't know, or they just are so afraid because the doctor has them in so much fear, like, well, if you go off of this, it's going to be detrimental to you and you have to keep taking it. So they just keep taking it. But so I wonder how often that happens and people ignore the signs of their own body. Like my grandma, she picked up on it right away. And then, my mom called me and they're like, well, we know you're like the, holistic health, like, person to talk to in the family, like, about all that kind of stuff. So tell us what's going on. And so, I did a quick search and I said, it's depleting or CoQ10. No doctor is ever supposed to prescribe a statin drug without supplementing CoQ10 in your body because they know that this drug depletes it. And, it's actually ubiquinol. It's ubiquitous throughout the body. It's very important. And but they know this, but they don't ever tell you. Or I don't know. Most doctors probably don't because they just don't. They don't research enough about it, and they just prescribe it because they just are told to. I don't know. But anyways, so. That's just an example of how to listen to your body. If you feel that you can't go on walks, or you feel like you're sick, you feel restless, or your body's just off in some way, figure it out right away and get yourself off of the drug and maybe figure that there's a better way to do it. That's, I don't think you should ignore the signs of your body and just kind of power through it, And I wonder how many people do that, and then they end up in a place where they are on these antipsychotic drugs or on these antidepressants, and they go nuts because the signs were there before, but they just didn't listen to them, or their doctor just told them to ignore the signs. They're like, oh, but I'm feeling this, and they just said, oh, just don't worry about that. Just that's gonna be all right. You'll get used to it, because they love to tell you that. Just give your body time to adjust.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah.
Right. It'll get there, don't worry. So, I don't know. But anyway, so I think we're just about out of time here. We're going to go ahead and wrap. But we want to thank our guest today, Dr. Yolande Lucire. She doesn't have a website right now. I think, wasn't that what she said? But you guys can Google her and find Yolande Lucire, psychiatrist, and find her YouTube video. We'll also post links to that. It's called Adverse Reactions to Psychiatric Drugs. You can find the article at the Activist Post and the interview with Brandon Tuberville, as we mentioned. He interviewed her, I think it was a little over a year ago or 2 years ago, called End the Lie, with forensic psychiatrist Yolande Lucire. Our friend Clint Richardson did one too, so she's out there. Also, Aline Danneman from the Vaccine Liberation Army has a bunch of information on this too, so you can find her website as well. So please check it out, and until next time, peace, truth, and love, y'all.
Peace, truth, and love, you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
When things are sad for you or becoming anxious, when you've got a lot of worries, are somehow disorders and real things that could be treated with pills. And of course there was an unholy relationship between the American Psychiatric Association, the pharmaceutical industry, and while these disorders were being created, the drug companies were busy finding people who had some of these criteria and testing pills. So that was the start of it. Now, we jump forward from 1980, been a few DSM-3s and a DSM-4, which increased the number of so-called disorders. The DSM-5 has increased it again, but indeed taken a lot of detail out, and in fact taken out knowledge, while allowing psychiatry to claim therapeutic jurisdiction over treating a lot of things, a lot of conditions and a lot of behaviours that it cannot influence. I see a lot of people who say, oh, this drug is saving my life. And you go through it with them and they'll tell you, no, they have suicide impulses every night, every day, they have weird dreams, weird nightmares with blood and guts and people chasing them, sometimes weird sexual nightmares. Their libido is zero, they haven't had sex for years, they're losing their relationships. And you say, well, why on earth do you think this drug's doing you any good? And they say, oh, I know, because if I miss a tablet, all the depression comes back. I say, yeah, but who's told you that's the depression coming back? That is the withdrawal state. If you withdraw suddenly, these drugs have a withdrawal reaction. And if you withdraw from the drug suddenly, you're going to get suicidal and depressed. And if you decide that you want to come off it, then you have to come off it very, very, very slowly. I mean, and they say,